Book 2, Soldier at the Door, Chapter 2. My wife, you are insane. Captain, do you have a moment? Karna asked through the partially opened office door. Zenas made contact again. Perrin quickly snatched up his quill and grabbed a clean piece of paper. Of course, send him in. Zenas came in dressed in regular work clothes and wearing an eager grin. Saw him again, sir, just before the Eastern Canals. I pulled back the patrols when I realized Zenas was talking to someone in the trees, Karna explained. I should get back out there. Certainly, Shin waved him away. Go, go. See if we have any other confused garters out there. Karna bounded back down the stairs. Sit, Zenas, Shin told him as he dipped his quill into the ink bottle. Tell me everything he said, no matter how bizarre. He still thinks you're some farmer's son? Yes, sir. I was strolling at the edges of the fields they just planted, hoping to catch sight of him again. Since I'm not in uniform, which is precisely why I recommended some changes last year, Shin grumbled. We could learn so much more if we weren't so obvious. But the command board, well, never mind. So, what did he say? He was a bit more coherent this time, Zenas explained. I think because I fed him first. He winced in apology. I'd taken an extra beef sandwich for midday meal and had it in my pocket in case I got hungry, and, well, the garters seemed half-starved. The captain shook his head. I have no problem with you feeding him, Zenas. It's a sandwich well spent. If he sees you as a provider, he'll become more comfortable with you and perhaps reveal what's going on. Zenas's face relaxed. I was hoping you'd feel that way, sir. I kind of already told him I could give him more tomorrow at the same time. Shin smiled. Well, bring more than a sandwich. It's a proven fact that the people will follow whoever will feed them. I'm hoping he'll eventually follow you all the way to this office. Zenas shrugged. I'm not sure I'm that skilled yet, sir. If you joined up officially, I could train you, the captain hinted. I need men like you. Thank you, sir, I know. Zenas shrugged again, looking down at his hands in bashfulness. It's just that... Perrin sat back to analyze his volunteer of 3 weeks. Zenas often demurred like that, as if intimidated by himself. But he was more naturally skilled than any soldier Perrin had met, and so far there had been no responses to the inquiries about a missing younger-than-legal boy, nor had there been any reports about a girl looking for her run-off boyfriend. The boy was as innocent as his face, which didn't even have the decency to sprout any pimples. Perrin saw Zenas in the market a few days ago, grinning at the sellers and receiving many shy and encouraging smiles from Mahrree's former students, but he was so naive he didn't even notice them. The boy was simply so pure. Perrin would snag him eventually. He just needed the right lure. But in the meantime, he picked up his quill and poised it over the paper. So, Zenas, your report? Zenas looked up from his hands and sat up at attention. He even did that better than most soldiers. Sorry, yes, sir. At first he told me we were planting our corn all wrong. Perrin's quill hesitated over the paper. He what? Zenas nodded. He'd been watching the farmer the other day and said that we should be planting the corn in small hills instead with the cut-up fish to nourish the plants. Much greater yields than planting the corn in rows. Shin put down the quill, perplexed. Why would he be concerned about our plantings? I thought it was an interesting idea, Zenas offered. Maybe the garter knows something about improving crops? Why would they? Or maybe he's planning to steal those crops in harvest season and thinks it's easier to hide in the small hills rather than rows. Zenas pondered that. Probably right, sir. Still, it would be interesting to try, don't you think? At a farm away from the forests to see if he's right? Perrin growled quietly. I'm not accustomed to taking agricultural tips from our enemies. What else did he say? Zenas cleared his throat. Well, this won't be too helpful either then. But maybe, he said that improving yields are crucial to feeding the population. We have lots of fallow land, and even small gardens could be used for vegetables and fruit trees. Our population is fed just fine, Perrin said steadily. We're at a stable and maintainable rate. We never have a lack, especially since the crop controls were established. He's interested in our population rates? Maybe because they need our food, Zena suggested. He said their women have so many children now. Perrin pointed at him. They are looking to raid our crops. Very good, Zenas. Now we know to keep our farms more carefully guarded, especially once harvest comes around. He quickly scrawled down some notes. Zenas smiled to have been of some use. I'm curious, Perrin paused, tapping his quill in the ink jar. Just how many children, did he say? Zenas nodded. Well, in the middle of his rambling, he said there was a woman who recently had her 15th child. Perrin's mouth dropped open. Then he said something about most of them having smaller families, averaging 6 or 7 children. Then he started on something about teaching chickens to fly. But Perrin was shaking his head slowly. A small family is 6 or 7 children? Unbelievable. Likely have so many to replace their population. I can only imagine how many of their people die each year. 14 here just last year. Zenas nodded soberly. Yes, I've heard about that, sir, from some of the men. Makes my back itch to think of it. Perrin chuckled. I just started thinking, sir, the young volunteer began hesitantly. You're a father, and seem to be a devoted one at that. If you could have more than 2 children, would you? Considering that it seems apparent garter women still have so many. Perrin stiffened. Do you know the name of Gadaman, Zenas? Zenas blinked rapidly at the captain's abrupt change in tone. Sounds vaguely familiar. Perhaps you're more familiar with his other title, Administrator of Loyalty? Zenas gulped. Yes, sir, that Gadaman. Would you like to meet the Administrator of Loyalty, Zenas? Perrin's tone was as cold as death. Zenas gulped again. No, sir. That's right, you don't. But asking such kinds of questions will earn you a one-way journey to Idemia and an extended discussion with Gadaman. To answer your questions, Zenas, no, I've never considered having more than 2 children. That's the law of the land, and I've sworn to uphold it. Quarrel the First recognized that our population couldn't exceed 1 million, or we'd run into the same divisions and shortages we suffered under the Great War in 200. I know all about that, sir. Zenas tried diplomatically to cut him off. If you did, then you wouldn't need a history refresher right now, Perrin snapped. After the war, Quarrel told families to maintain only a replacement population, that women should birth only 2 children. When his son Quarrel II took over, he enforced that law ruthlessly. While the first turned a blind eye to the occasional 3rd or 4th baby, his son made sure that any woman expecting a 3rd time never birthed that baby. If she survived the soldiers in their brutality, she certainly could never conceive again. Zenas swallowed hard, but the captain wasn't finished yet. 50 years ago, the drink was developed to ensure there would be no accidental violations of the law. Not only has it kept our population in balance, but has preserved women from the difficulties of expecting. I've seen it twice, Zenas, firsthand. It's an enormous sacrifice, and nothing a woman should have to endure too often. If the captain thought his lecture would scare the large young man into silence, he was mistaken. Sir, I know the sacrifices, Zenas said gravely. My older sister has 2 daughters. I saw her suffer. I also saw her joy when she held those newborns, and how much she adores her girls now. I know for a fact that she said the pain and suffering were nothing compared to becoming a mother. I didn't mean to be disrespectful to the laws. I merely wondered if you ever considered that maybe there could be another way. Perrin sat back, stunned by the boy's boldness. As I've said before, Zenas, no, I've never considered violating the laws of the land. At least not that one, he confessed with the smallest of smiles. Zenas hazarded a small smile, too, but it seemed to have a sad undertone. Understood, sir. I should have, well, never mind. That's all I have for you today." He made to get up out of the chair, but Perrin was struck by a thought and held up his hand to stop him. "Zenas, one question. Exactly how did the gardener know the farmer was planting corn? He would have to been across the upper canal there. For all he knew, the farmer was dropping peas or pumpkin seeds." Zenas hesitated. "It's too late in the season for peas, and pumpkins aren't sown in rows." "But would the gardener know that? If we plant corns in rows, might not we plant everything in rows?" Shin pressed. "I'm not exactly a gardener, as you might have guessed, but I do know that seeds are very small and difficult to identify from a distance." Zenas looked perplexed for a moment. "Maybe he went out at night and dug up the seeds just to see what had been planted?" Perrin pondered that, along with the odd look his volunteer tried to conceal. He seemed to be worried that he hadn't asked the gardener how he knew what seeds were planted. "Possibly," he decided. "You're dismissed, Zenas. Remember, extra food for our babbling gardener tomorrow. Let's see if Sweetbread doesn't loosen his tongue even more." Zenas stood up, apparently relieved. "Thank you, sir. Hope I have something promising tomorrow." After he left the room, Perrin whistled under his breath. 6 or 7 children, he whispered. He sat quietly for a minute, lost in thought. Then he forced himself to shake the traitor's thought out of his head. The second year of Mahrree and Perrin's marriage flew by even more quickly than the first. It was a nauseating, exhausting, sweet, gratifying, terrifying, sleepless, fantastic blur. There were many events and funny things Mahrree had decided she should write down, but she always forgot until it was in the middle of the night and she was up with someone small, or using the washroom, or was disturbed by the churning in her belly, or the snoring of her husband, or by an irrational fear, or by a legitimate concern, or simply up because nothing had awakened her, so she was worried that nothing was waking her. That's when she thought she could record what she wanted to remember, especially those days in the past raining season, when she and Perrin rested on their bed on the floor in the gathering room, doing nothing but watching Jatesy and tending to his stitches. But even then, she kept putting off stepping away from it all to record it for later. Before she realized it, it was the 38th day of weeding season again, 3/21, and in the evening of their second wedding anniversary. This year, the Shin family was celebrating. Half of the family was asleep, the other half would be soon. The sky was a magnificent combination of swirling reds, purples, and blues, but Mahrree was the only one who noticed it. They were on a blanket in the middle of their yard in a bed of yellow weedy flowers. Their garden had shrunk considerably since Perrin finished the latest addition to the house. Tonight, Jatesy kept leaving the blanket to practice her new trick of walking. She loved to hoot after the occasional cart and driver that passed. 5-week-old Pato, born on the 91st and last day of planting season, with thick brown hair and pale blue eyes, slept snuggled into his mother. Mahrree sat next to her husband, who lay on the blanket with his eyes closed. He promised he wouldn't fall asleep, but Mahrree knew what his slow, deep breathing meant. They had been talking about the amazing changes of the past 2 years, but neither could stay coherent enough to complete a complicated thought. A few moments ago, Perrin's words had dribbled away into a slur of slumber. If anyone had asked them to debate these days, Mahrree thought, it would have been about whose turn it was to change which child's soiled cloths. And halfway through the discussion, they would have asked each other what they were talking about. But Mahrree's mind was quite fully occupied tonight, and she'd spent many weeks, moons actually, trying to find a way to express all that cluttered her thoughts. Lack of sleep disorganized her, but it also seemed to embolden her. It was time to confront Perrin. She couldn't wait for them to not be tired. She'd be a grandmother by then. Besides, her husband should be used to ambush situations. "Perrin," she said, glancing at the gate to make sure Jatesy couldn't escape the yard. He grunted drowsily. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like if we could have more than 2 children?" That woke him up. She knew it would, and she fought down a smile. "What did you say?" he blurted, as he rolled over to look at her with hazy eyes. "You birthed Pato barely 5 weeks ago, and what did you say?" "I said," she began, and realizing there was much he wasn't going to understand this evening, tried a different direction. "I've been thinking about the village and families, about what if families were allowed to have more than 2 children? If they could have as many children as the Creator allowed them? If women didn't have to take the drink after the second child?" Perrin propped himself up on his elbow and rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. "Oh, that's what this is about. You're worried about the drink. I told you I'll come with you. Don't worry, the mixture has improved since our mother's time. It's supposed to be quite painless now. I didn't realize that was on your mind." "No, I wasn't thinking about taking the drink until now," she said grimly. "But I was thinking about something more. We got our 2 children so quickly, and just as quickly it will be over. Not that I won't be happy to sleep again, but somehow it doesn't feel right to me." Perrin watched her for a moment, trying to work out her direction. "I don't remember you ever talking this way before." "I never dared before," she admitted, "but now I must. When I was a teacher, parenting a child or two seemed such a great burden. But now that I'm a mother, I see what an adventure it is. My view of the whole world has changed in only one short year. But Perrin, why does the adventure have to be so restricted?" He sat up and eyed her sternly. "For the good of the community, you know that. Do you need a history lesson? I feel I've been giving those a lot lately," he added in an odd mumble to himself. "No, I don't," she snapped. "Mahrree," he said firmly, "you know the drink's far better than what the kings used to do to women who kept having babies. Besides," his tone turned matter-of-fact, "we'll run out of space if people have too many children, and women's bodies can't birth more than 2 children without permanent damage. The administrator of Family's Life Studies proved that. Notices were everywhere." "Yes," Mahrree said with a dangerous gleam in her eye. "Dr. Brizac did that, correct? Quite convenient, don't you think, that a study verifies the very practice they've already engaged in for the past 50 years? Perrin stared at her, recognizing her debating voice. They fell in love debating each other 2 years ago, but his expression hinted he knew he wasn't about to enjoy what was coming. "What is this all about?" "I find it very difficult to believe that Brizac's study was completely unbiased and objective," she announced. "Mahrree," Perrin sighed, "as administrators go, if we were forced to have one over for dinner, he'd be my first pick. Even my father has said he's a very decent man." "And you could cook that dinner yourself," she declared. "The very decent administrator of Family Life is perpetuating a very convenient lie." "You're accusing the administrators of lying?" His eyebrows rose. "Are you sure you're still not experiencing the lingering effects of birthing? The commander of Edge can't have his wife speaking traitorously," he said, only half in jest. Mahrree sighed. She had to tell him everything she was thinking, and while she was quite confident how he would react, she couldn't keep quiet. That was what he loved about her, wasn't it? Her ability to think of things in new ways? That she cared for no one's opinion but the Creator's? That's what he told her at their wedding. It was time to see if it was still true. Besides, "You've admitted yourself that the administrators aren't always forthcoming," she reminded him. "You've shown me enough of your father's messages about the color of the sky. And it's not traitorous talk. It's just, well, have we really evaluated all of our options? There must be more places for us to settle. I mean, there's so much land, yet the administrators limit us to only this region. Why not go west to where the ruins are? We can build around them. Every report that comes back says they're poisoned, but I simply can't believe that. Terup didn't go crazy from poison 138 years ago. He went crazy with eagerness. And there were no more people there simply because their time was over. Their test was finished. They didn't die because of dangerous ground or air. It doesn't make sense. If they died, then where are their bodies? Shouldn't there be some kinds of bones or remains? Perrin just stared at her, absently running a finger up and down his son's tiny arm. Mahrree wasn't sure what she saw in his eyes. She knew her words were disloyal, but if she couldn't trust her husband with her thoughts, she took advantage of a stunned silence and plowed on. And the mountains, what's on the other side? No one's tried to find out. I'll admit I'm not sure how to traverse that boulder field. Could take a few days, I imagine, and getting up and over the mountains would undoubtedly be difficult. But you told me yourself a few weeks ago that going through the forest wasn't what you expected and was actually comforting. What if the boulder field is the same way? And the mountains? We don't know because we've never tried. The only thing in the way are the garters. And Perrin, what if you eliminated every last garter above edge? If any survived, maybe they're gone or frightened of you. Can't we take advantage of your success? Perrin continued to stare, absorbing only half of what she said. His voice was merely a low rumble when he finally spoke. How long have you been thinking about this? Getting to the other side? It's been building in my mind for several moons now. That's a long time to think, he replied with an unreadable expression. Mahrree felt she was about to burst. Perrin, tell me honestly, isn't there any way to work with the remaining garters? Any way to get around them? My wife, you are insane, he whispered, searching her eyes for evidence. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? I do, and I'm not insane. Why do men assume women are unstable when they're expecting or have just birthed? She exclaimed. We shed a few tears, fret a bit, and you and Dr. Brizac, she sneered at his name, conclude that we're going crazy, simply because we react differently than men. She scoffed. Oh, I'd love to see a man, how he would respond to the dramatic changes in his body if he were expecting. Frankly, I think our sex handles it and recovers remarkably well, and we emerge even more focused and determined. So I see, he murmured. She exhaled. Just humor me for a few minutes. Please, can we work with the garters? He twitched. The ones I encountered in raining season weren't interested in talking. They were interested in you. She swallowed at that, the same way she had repeatedly when he finally told her the truth about that night. But, he continued reluctantly, something new is going on in the trees. If it's a result of the last season or not, I really don't know. It seems that there's a lost garter. And he does talk. I have a new volunteer named Zenas who happens upon him quite by accident at the fresh spring, and for the past 2 weeks they've been talking. Since Zenas isn't in uniform, the garter thinks he's a local boy, and he's become quite eager to see him, especially since Zenas brings him food from the mess hall. Mahrree's eyes grew big with expectation. Perrin tried to shut it down as soon as he saw it. But what you're proposing is ridiculous, unheard of. Jatesy plopped down on her father's legs and began to suck her thumb. Mahrree sat up taller. And what does the garter say? Nothing really useful. He's lost and confused and blathers on incoherently. Zenas tells me what he says, and it's mostly nonsense. What I can tell you, he exhaled, obviously not wanting to divulge, but likely feeling the need to be honest with her. Zenas mentioned that the garter told him that their women have many babies, even as many as 15. Mahrree's mouth dropped open so far that Peto's fist could have fit neatly inside. 15! That's far more than I imagined, but I knew it. I read that report from the Office of Family. I'm sure they didn't think anyone would take the time, but I did. And it said women couldn't safely have more than 2 before causing permanent damage. But that doesn't make any sense. Who would they have studied to know this? Oh, but 15! She fixated on the possibility. Perrin noticed. He looked at her suspiciously as he ran his fingers through Jatesy's stringy light brown hair. She used his lap as a pillow. Why does that interest you so much? Because it's proof. He shook his head, bewildered. It's proof of nothing, Mahrree. It's from a disoriented garter who's not the most reliable source of information. And if it were true, which I doubt, it demonstrates only that they're uncivilized and cruel, destroying their women's bodies to replenish their population. They give birth to creatures that attack us at night, steal our goods, and threaten our families. That's why I kill them. Mahrree flinched. After a quiet moment, she meekly said, "But they still have many children." Perrin scoffed. "And live in the wilderness, skirmishing among themselves, struggling to survive, watching their mates die, their children starve." His descriptions were too much, and yes, she was still feeling some irrational effects of birthing. "Stop it!" Mahrree exclaimed in a loud whisper. Perrin clamped shut his mouth and analyzed his wife. "What is this all about, Mahrree?" She couldn't put it off any longer. Her time was growing short, and the date was already set. "Perrin, what if I don't take the drink? What if we have a third baby instead? I don't believe my body would be maimed or my mind destroyed. I just need to rest first. Then—" Perrin was suddenly right in her face, on all fours, straddling her and glaring with horror and confusion. Jatesy, sprawled on the blanket, wondered what happened to her pillow. "Mahrree Shin, I must inform you that you are sounding at this moment like a traitor." His voice was cold and fierce. "Not my wife. Not my wife." Mahrree had expected this response. He played it out quite as she imagined he would. A part of him, Captain Shin, was loyal to the administrators, and she knew the captain would rear up as soon as she confessed her idea. But she didn't burst into tears or shrink away. Perrin's eyebrows furrowed in surprise at her lack of it. She was overly calm, like a crazed person who'd been planning a bizarre scheme for seasons, which she had. "Perrin," she said steadily, "just consider it for a moment. The writings tell us to bring more into the world so all can have an opportunity to go through the test. We should have more children." "Why are you saying these things?" he whispered severely, and looked around to see if anyone was near enough to hear. "Because our ancestors had many more than two," she insisted. "I've done the math. I know I'm right." He shook his head. "The world began with 1,000 and the Creator," she said. "Then he paired them up to populate the land." "Yes," he said slowly, trying to put his shock in his back pocket for a moment. "Now, 1,000 people means 500 pairs. If they had an average of 6.5 children in each family—" "Where did you get that number?" he demanded in a whisper. She was a bit startled by his exclamation, but decided it was a natural reaction to the onslaught she was throwing at him. "It's just an average, all right? You can say 6 then, or 7. "Still 6!" he exclaimed hoarsely. "You can barely keep track of Jatesy while Pato is feeding. How could anyone keep track of 6 children?" She would not be deterred. "Couldn't the older help take care of the younger?" "I suppose," he conceded. "But how would they know what to do?" "Learn from their mothers? I don't know. That's not the point. Besides, some could have less and some could have more." Perrin stared at her wild-eyed. "So, at a rate of 6.5 children, I ran scenarios for 4 and 8 as well," she explained, "but this seems to be the most accurate average." "You really have been thinking about this." "There's little else to do when I'm nursing a baby. So, 500 couples have 6.5 children for 3,250 people. Pair them up for another generation, and at 6.5 children per couple, and that becomes about 10,500. The third generation at the same rate becomes around 34,000. The fourth generation is, what was it? Oh, yes, 110,500. Fifth generation means almost 360,000. And by the sixth generation, we have over 1,100,000 people, give or take. Perrin only blinked. "The Great War broke out during the 7th generation. Perrin, How many people were in the world then? Does the army have any good estimates? He shook his head slightly, trying to catch up to her calculations, and frantically trying to figure out the dangerous direction his wife was headed. Not better than anyone else. Well over 1 million people. At least 200,000 died over those 5 years. If it weren't for the war, we'd have too many people now. 1 million is all that the land could support. Mahrree ignored his rationale, cultivated into him by his Idamean education. Over 1 million people. The only way we got so many was because families were bigger. Now, Perrin, consider this. What if the world is already supporting more than only us, just somewhere else? How many garters might there be? He thought for a moment. No one's sure. When they left, there were maybe 2,000, but they can't be more than 10,000 now, according to some of the estimates my father's been given. That's still a large number to battle, especially if they arm their wives and children. That's why we're increasing the army to 15,000. Has anyone ever encountered an armed woman or child? She pressed. Perrin paused. No, he admitted. That's the rumor, though. Mahrree was unimpressed. Rumor. And since when do you believe in rumors? His eyes flared, and she realized she'd nudged awake the captain again. Rumor, Mrs. Shin, he said in a low growl, was how we knew the garters were becoming active again. And you might even say rumor is also how I found out about you being marked last season. Mahrree scrunched up her mouth, realizing she was losing that debate. So she shifted it. Then I suppose you should also believe the rumor that garter women can have up to 15 babies. So with birth rates like that, might there not be more garters? Maybe even tens of thousands. Surviving in the wilderness, Perrin challenged back. Why not? Didn't our ancestors live in a kind of wilderness at the first and have many children? Perrin shook his head to clear out the fog. Mahrree, what is your point? The Creator made us capable of having more children, she nearly exploded. Families were much larger, but no one remembers or even thinks about that because all the family line records were destroyed. That fire can't have been an accident. Quirrell the First did it on purpose. So generations later, no one would remember what we once had. He stared at her with what she thought might have been fear. But having never seen fear in him before, she didn't know how to interpret the look that tried to penetrate her mind. If she wasn't holding her newborn, she would have gripped his shoulders and shook him. It's all a lie, Perrin, started by the kings and continued by the administrators. I've searched the writings, and I can't find anywhere that the Creator said, and when this people has reached 1 million, cease to multiply. We're only replacing now, and many couples aren't even doing that. But we can. My body can. Mahrree, he whispered urgently. You've got to stop. You don't know what you're saying, what you're asking. He wasn't holding a baby, so he did grip her shoulders and shake her gently. Everything you're saying, you must realize, is traitorous. Please, Mahrree, if you love your family, just stop. Remember, the administrators don't care much for the writings. I've heard Nico Mal say that those who are believers have ceased being thinkers. That was the wrong thing to say. Perrin's face immediately registered his mistake as Mahrree began to fume. That has got to be the most illogical, stupid thing I've ever heard. We believe because we think. We choose to believe, which indicates a great deal of thought went into the decision. What, if Mal believes he has a mind, does that mean he no longer thinks with it? Obviously. She was never skilled at holding her tongue, not even with her fingers. But she had to shake off the narrow-mindedness of Nico Mal to get back to her point. But they've told us that we can still believe. And is not continuing to multiply against our beliefs? Could we not argue that we must follow our hearts, she implored? Besides, my mother had only one, and so did your mother. Think about this. What if we have the two they didn't? His eyes nearly popped out. Now you want 4 children? He screamed in a whisper and looked around. It would have been much safer to have the conversation in the house, in a closet, under a blanket, into a pillow. Woman, what is with you tonight? But couldn't we make that argument, she pushed, that we want to have the children our mothers had a right to, but didn't? With your father's connections, couldn't he get us permission from Brizac? He shook his head violently, as if that would change the view he saw of his wife. It didn't. The High General challenging the administrators, he asked, to make sure he heard her correctly. You defied them all by going into the forest again. That was different. Mahrree, this I can't think of a worse idea. Do you know of anyone who deliberately had more than 2 children? I mean, besides the occasional twins or triplets. No, not really. But I think that's because no one has tried. No, it is not, Perrin said darkly. Many have tried. I don't know about this village, but I've seen the families from other villages who've attempted it. A smile began to grow on Mahrree's face. So it's possible. No, it's not, Perrin repeated in a panicked hush. Physically, maybe yes, but in no other way. He sighed and sat down in front of her. When I was in command school, I served for a time in King Orn's courts building, as all future officers did. I saw several families come in, with 2 children and a mother large with expecting. Mahrree, they were broken apart. His voice became husky as he saw the tears building in her eyes. A judge would evaluate the parents, always find them unfit to care for so many, and disband them. The father would be incarcerated for not ensuring his wife took the drink. Mahrree's chin began to quiver. Perrin tenderly tucked a lock of her hair behind her ear. The mother would be sent to a building which houses the mentally ill, because she was unfit to care for any children. And their children? Tears were already streaking down Mahrree's face. The children and the new baby would be given to different sets of parents, people who found themselves unable to have babies. The administrators merely took the King's Office of Family and put Dr. Brizac over it. Nothing there has changed. Mahrree sniffled. The runes claimed as their own a 4-year-old only a few weeks ago, she whispered. The little girl said her family traveled to Idemia, but then they disappeared. She closed her eyes and sighed. Seisha was told the girl's parents and younger brother were taken by garters. Garter snatched. Oh, Perrin, they weren't, were they? Her mother may have been expecting again. He smoothed her hair. Don't tell Seisha your suspicions, he warned her softly. Just let her enjoy becoming a mother. That's all that can be done now. He kissed her cheek. Do you understand why we can't risk this? Even if my father mentions your idea, we might be under suspicion. Our babies could still be taken. I love our children too. Let's be grateful we have them and desire no more than we should. Oh, I wish I could, but I can't because She faltered as she sobbed. She'd had it all figured out, too. It could have worked. It could have. But now? Because you what? He asked quietly. Because I dream, she burst out. I dreamed the night we were engaged, and the night Jatsi was born, and again when Pato was born, and a few other times too. Perrin, it sounds crazy, I know, but I was sitting with children all around me, and there was a huge house with weathered gray wood, and window boxes and herb plants growing in them. We needed something so large for all the family, and there were mountains. And the children were ours, over a dozen, I think, and I was so happy. Perrin's face showed no new emotion. Mahrree, a dream, simply a dream. That it came on significant nights for you is just a coincidence. Mahrree was stunned that he didn't seem moved by her revelation. In fact, he seemed to think nothing of it at all, and that bothered her immensely. It had been so important to her. So comforting, so exciting, so glorious. Are you sure it's not a gift from the Creator? She tried again. Maybe it was the captain that was in charge of his mind right now, not her husband. She had to find her parent again. Are you sure a coincidence isn't really a miracle? In the writings, there are accounts of people having dreams that came true. He sighed. Mahrree, I don't think that happens anymore. I like to believe they did, but now, have you heard of anyone recently dreaming? Dreams with significance? Oh, Perrin, people don't share such dreams lightly. It took me more than 2 years to dare to tell you mine. Perrin sighed again. Tell me more about it. What else is there? Any landmarks? Any activity? Mahrree hesitated, but he did seem open to the idea, if only a little. Well, there is something else. I guess this is the part that makes it seem truly unbelievable. She paused before rushing out the words. I was sitting in a garden, a big one, and I was weeding it, and I was happy. Perrin burst out laughing, startling his daughter, who was drifting off to sleep on the blanket. Well, there you have it. Ridiculous. What kind of garden was it? Mahrree sighed miserably, she confessed. Vegetables. He grinned as if he just won a complicated game. Oh, well then, you know what it is. It's your condition playing tricks on you. His smugness was insulting. I was not in my condition when we became engaged. Ah, but you were dreaming of the time you would be, right? He smiled virtuously. You went to bed that night dreaming of the day you'd hold your own little baby. Come now, I know the minds of women well enough now. 2 years of marriage had apparently made him an expert. Mahrree felt as if a crushing boulder had just rolled on top of her hope, and it made her chest tight and achy. I hate to admit it, but that's a bit true, she murmured. That night we decided to marry, I was thinking of you, of a family. But the dreams had seemed so real, so vivid that she could even make out from which direction the sun hit the house. She couldn't let it go so easily. Do you really think that was only my imagination and coincidence? Definitely, he said, in a tone that suggested she should never speak of it again. Now, he continued, suddenly cheerful, I propose we get these sleepy children into the house and catch a nap ourselves before Pato's next feeding, which should happen by my estimation in 17 minutes. And just like that, it was over. Her dream house, her garden, her hopes for more children, all of it wiped away as if it were merely a drawing in the dirt. Perrin, the deluge, destroyed it all. Well, not so much him, she admitted grudgingly, as the ache in her chest sharpened into genuine pain. It was the administrators. It was their world. It was everyone. He was simply reminding her of all the obstacles that stood in the way. He didn't create them, he just pointed them out. Still, couldn't have he looked a bit harder for a way around them? She watched Perrin as he gently scooped up his little girl, wrapped her in the blanket, and kissed her sleeping form. Mahrree loved him, she was sure of that, but he seemed further away tonight, not so much the most perfect man in the world. She almost forgave him as he tenderly carried Jatesy into the house, but she couldn't let this go. Women have lists in their brains that keep a tally of everything, and in Mahrree's mind it appeared again, ways in which Perrin's mind is not like mine. Underneath, dogs are better than cats, and boots do belong on the eating table, Mahrree recorded, dreams are nonsense. They didn't talk much that evening after Perrin put Jatesy to bed, just brief civil exchanges before he went to his study. And during Pato's last feeding, Mahrree fell into a deep sleep, fed by exhaustion mixed with despair. There was nothing she could do about the date, already set for next week. The midwives had made the appointment when they reported to Idemia the names of all the women who had recently birthed a second time. A coach carrying an assistant from Family Life and several vials of the drink would stop at a small, windowless building just outside the market, as it did every 2 weeks. Mahrree had seen the assistant's arrival a couple of times before. She was a brutish woman, nearly as large as Perrin, likely chosen because she was both female, allegedly, and powerful enough to strong-arm any woman who had a sudden last-minute change of heart. Mahrree had also seen the mothers waiting for their turns, usually a handful each time. Some were there voluntarily after their first babies, not wanting to endure the experience of birthing again. But none of them ever looked up, as if some oppressive and invisible hand forced their heads down to inspect the gravel at their feet. Then they were ushered, one in at a time, into the building, accompanied by their own mothers, grandmothers, or the occasional brave husband. The mothers didn't look any different, coming out again, after swallowing down a concoction of bitter herbs and burning liquid, the brutal recipe created by Dr. Brizek. The effects didn't occur for about another hour, Mahrree had been told. That's why the women went straight home, because the brew soon made its way into the womb and cramped it into a useless nothingness. Perrin had said the Garters were cruel to force their women to have so many children, but she was sure that deliberately killing the part of her body that made new life was crueler. Now she was rethinking her decision to have Perrin accompany her, with his current attitude instead of her own mother. Then again, while Heisman had been most attentive and helpful during birthing, she also had a way of multiplying Mahrree's anxiety. Being concerned about each pain was one thing, but gasping and worrying and rushing to horrible conclusions was quite another. Heisman meant well, but Mahrree was quite sure that the constant reassurance that everything was going to be all right was supposed to go from grandmother to birthing mother, not the other way around. Maybe, Mahrree thought glumly as her heavy head nodded that night, she'd just go by herself to take the drink. She already felt utterly alone. Perrin hadn't bothered to come to bed yet either, nor would he. They'd done too much fighting that night to consider anything like an argument. As she drifted off to sleep, her infant tucked securely next to her, she didn't know that a candle remained lit in the small hours of the night on their eating table until it eventually extinguished itself. Nor did she know that her copy of the writings and old maps lay open next to several pages filled with dates, calculations, cross-outs, notes, and more calculations. Nor did she realize that Perrin snored peacefully with his head on the table and a quill balanced in his fingers. Early in the dark morning, Mahrree padded down wearily down the stairs in search of clean changing cloths. Both children were in her bed again. It was simply easier to keep Peta within arm's reach during the night, and now Jatesy was braving the dark to climb the stairs and scale the side of the massive bed to sleep with her parents. While the bed was big enough for 8 soldiers, it somehow wasn't large enough for 2 small children when they stretched and rolled, pushing their parents to the very edges. That was likely the real reason Perrin hadn't come to bed. Jatesy had kicked him so hard a few weeks ago, she actually bruised her father's ribs. He felt safer on the small sofa. In the light that poured into the side window from the full greater moon, Mahrree saw him sprawled on the sofa, snoring softly. She made a mental note that they should buy something that accommodated his long legs and broad shoulders. As she turned by the table, she saw the writings and notes. Why all of those were out, she couldn't imagine. And she didn't really care right then. She had only a few minutes before her babies would be waking, and she found herself turning back to the table. Noiselessly, she shifted the papers and bent closer to make out the notations in the dim light. Something softened in her aching chest as she read Perrin's writing and recognized the other pages. References to the writings. Calculations of garter population in varying circumstances. Minimum dimensions of land needed to house different populations. Maps from his collection. Calculations of the world population before and after the Great War. The words weathered gray and window boxes. Mahrree looked at Perrin. She was tempted to rush over and kiss him, but knew that he needed the sleep almost as much as she did. Her husband. That's who he was right now. Captain Shin had been there the night before, growling at her like a rabid wolf, but he was gone now. She lived with 2 men, both too large to be contained in one body at the same time. Captain Shin had stood on the podium shouting at her during the debates, but it was Perrin she fell in love with away from the platform. Captain Shin was the man with the sword and the barely controlled temper raging through the forests, but Perrin was the man who pulled his babies out of her arms the moment he took off his uniform jacket. Captain Shin was the one who declared her thoughts traitorous, but Perrin was the one who tried to see if anything could be done about her dreams. She could live with both of them, as long as Perrin was around more than the officer. She pulled out her mental list and did her best to blot out "dreams are nonsense" as she took the clean cloths back upstairs. Nothing had changed, she knew. There was no more hope for her or for a bigger family. The drink was still in her near future. But she felt as if her husband had spent the night lifting off that crushing boulder and heaving it away as far as he could. Granted, he couldn't send it far, but he had tried. She got up again an hour later as the sun was rising and carried both babies down the stairs, balanced on each hip. The pain in her chest had subsided to a dull ache, but she could live with that. Not surprisingly, the eating table was completely cleared, and Perrin snored in a new position on the sofa. She smiled sweetly at him and dropped his babies on his chest. "Let me guess," he mumbled as he slowly opened his eyes and put a steadying hand on each child. "It's morning already?" "According to some farm animals, yes." She bent over and kissed him. He grinned sleepily. Not that we have any time to argue, but I'm curious. What was that for?" "For being my husband." Perrin struggled to sit up with his children, his baby cradled in one arm while his toddler sat unhelpfully on his belly, as his wife went into the kitchen to start breakfast. He righted himself and glanced in a quick panic at the table, then sighed when he remembered he had already cleaned up his work. He didn't need her seeing it. Not again. No one would see his calculations and notes again, now smoldering on the hearth. He couldn't shake Hogel's words to him in raining season, right after he was injured. Hogel had said that not only the refuser was after Perrin, but his family, too. And why? Because Mahrree would someday prove to be a very dangerous woman. Perrin had thought maybe some year or decade, but not within a few moons. But there it was. Mahrree could see what no one else bothered to look at. She already was the most dangerous woman in the world. That's why Perrin burned all his notes. He didn't need written evidence of that lying around. Her calculations had been correct. Her suggestions of how many garters there could still be somewhere else, even at conservative birth rates, were staggering. And there was nothing he could do about it, he realized. Maybe send some of the ideas to his father to suggest 15,000 in the Army might not be enough. But the notion of going somewhere else, exploring, increasing their own family size. People simply weren't supposed to think like that. There were rules and limits to the world. Why was he suddenly thinking like an administrator? For a brief moment, he envisioned his grandfather glaring at him in disappointment. Wasn't it General Shin who told him to go over the wall, invade the forest, do what no one else could do? Perrin did many things no one else had done, but he simply couldn't do this. There was no way he could find to successfully fulfill Mahrree's dreams. He tried most of the night, but no possibility he entertained ended happily. Everything ended in Idemia. He adjusted his small children on his lap and kissed each one of them as they stared up at him with eyes far too wide awake for such an early hour. One pair was dark chestnut brown, the other pair was pale blue, turning gray. Annoy and anger the refuser. According to Hogel, these two soft little faces would someday annoy and anger the refuser. Perrin sighed at his babies and tried to smile. Maybe Hogel was mistaken. He'd been up the entire night before he told Perrin his impressions of his family, and he must have been exhausted. Perrin and his family were no threats to anyone. But the words sounded hollow in his mind. Rector Hogel-Densel, in all of his 82 years, was never wrong. And he had dreams, too. He'd never told his nephew exactly how he knew the refuser had a personal grudge against lowly Perrin Shin, but Hogel's dreams were so vivid he couldn't deny them. And now Mahrree was having dreams. But to Perrin, they were nightmares. That is the end of Chapter 2. Doodle-doo-doo, doodle-doo-doo. No, that's not a good ending song either. Kind of sounds like the sound my Roku makes. Anyway, thank you. I'll see you next time. Or you'll listen to me next time. Never mind.